Thank you for joining us for another webinar.
No, pleasure. So this is the first one from the series, no? That's what I understood.
Yes, this is our first.
So tell me how long it takes, and I know the theme, but
we will be giving 17 minutes to each speaker, tops, and once the discussion of the speeches are done, then we will go on a Q&A. The idea is to provide the official information with regards to the knowledge of what is happening right now in Ukraine, where we at, where we get to see, and so on and so forth. This is the first series of a lot of webinars that are going to take place already. So we're looking forward to that. And Joseph.
All right.
And as we go through the development of the process will also change, like the podcasts have changed.
Okay, then I suggest you that you give a floor to Mark first, because he is from academic world.
I wanted to give it first to you, but it's fine.
Yeah, because I need to catch a pace of discussion, you know, how we structure it, what we do it. So he's I think there is American University in Kiev. That's what his title is.
Yes.
And how long this American University in Kiev exists? Because I have never heard about it.
Kurt.
Kurt. I got it now. Yes. So it's fairly recent, no?
Yes, it's been there from the time.
Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. Hello, Marios.
Hi.
Hello.
The war started. When they started, the war started.
Oh. I see.
But it's good. It's good. So it's been quite active, and they're trying to do a lot of good things. So.
And this is an academic institute, but is it a research institute, or it's full-fledged university?
University powered by Arizona State.
Powered by Arizona State, so they have a degrees, the bachelor's and so on. Oh, okay.
That's how I see it. Bachelor's and masters, I presume.
Okay.
But it will be good. Please mind that this is recorded already. Obviously, the webinar, when it's gonna come, will be cut somehow. We will edit it, and then it will go on the website, on the YouTube of the website.
So this is not live.
No, it is live. It is live, but eventually we will also upload it in case.
Eventually, of course.
That's the idea. That's the idea, that we become an open source of information with regard to our statements and our policies.
No, I participate in some of them, which are recorded and then not live, recorded and then put on.
I prefer the live. I prefer live.
It's okay.
More lively discussion, but obviously once we post it, more people will have the opportunity to see it.
Right. Now it's timing is not very good, because everybody watching this, football and all this, World Cup and something, and as we speak now, the game has started. So in the 7 o'clock Georgian time. So
we had to start somewhere, because always there will be something.
Of course.
Something.
Of course, but
the idea is that we do it as consistent as everything else.
Okay.
We will be making some changes, because Joseph will get an extra license from us with regard to the Zoom link. So the Zoom registrations are going to change. The links for the speakers are going to change. Probably the background will eventually change, because we're talking with several producers to let us know how they can do it in a better, more not professional, but more
screen. You need the green screen. It's not that difficult, but
you don't need the green screen. No, you don't need the green. You need a lot of things. If we were to do it live, yes, you need a green screen probably, but that depends if you want to build something. Because the web TV, in the web TV, we will build stuff. So
Do you know how many registered participants we have on the webinar? Do you have statistics?
we have 13. We have 13. Hi, Mark.
Hey, how are you guys?
Hello, how are you?
Let me just set up my.
I think I see the Acropolis on the back, or not.
You see what? The Acropolis, the history of
Acropolis.
Byzantium, the history of, you know, you have Homer, the Odyssey, Odyssea. You have, yeah, you have ancient Greek dictionaries here. Yeah.
Mark could have easily been an honorary Greek.
Oops.
I see.
Sorry.
There
All right.
There you go. This is how this is how the Acropolis is dying.
Yeah. Exactly. Just give me a second so the students can see.
No worries.
See. All right. Good to see you all, guys.
Good. You
Good
too.
to see you.
I'm gonna wait a couple of minutes and we're gonna start no matter what, so we can be on time. And
Okay.
whoever else is gonna join us, they're gonna join us. Yep, more people are coming in. But the idea is we will start 5 minutes past. It will be deducted from me. Please note that this is recorded. So it's already been recorded. Obviously, we're gonna edit it once this thing goes on YouTube, but you know. But thank you very much, dear speakers, for joining us. This is a very first webinar of multiple webinars that are going to take place. Now I'm going to say those things again and again and again. But we look forward to a very fruitful collaboration with regard to several topics that are going to be pointed out. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in. We're going to start in about 4 minutes. And this is the part where music usually plays on the back end. Classical
Yeah,
music.
when we edit, we'll just put in some intro material.
So since Ambassador Gela told us about the football games, who's playing?
Uruguay now plays with Ghana.
Very good. I'm with Ghana.
Where's
Nice.
that?
I'm with Ghana.
Where's that?
In Ghana. But no, they have a good team. They have a good team.
Yeah, I think the drama of this first phase of this championship is that slot clubs and all these online platforms for bidding are winning enormous amount of money out of the surprises.
But talking about the game, I don't know if you saw what happened between Japan and Germany.
Yeah.
With this half, like three and a half quarters of the ball out.
Yeah, in my mind, I think that was the ball crossed the line in what I saw, but I don't know what kind of measurement they have.
This is too much. This is too much with regards to you know, where do the limitations of technology end?
Yeah.
This is quite interesting as a subject, not only in terms of football, but this is like the very short thing that makes history change.
Unbelievable, huh?
Yeah. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, I will be starting now. So allow me first of all to thank you all for coming in. I know that more people are going to come in and going to join us, but in order to make up for the time and the essence, and to give plenty of time to all of our speakers to speak, allow me to welcome you first of all to a very first series of webinars that are going to take place through Strategy International and in the following months and years, we hope. But the idea is to bring some of the most acquainted experts with regards to many international and global events that are taking place. In this case, this is not a very good news discussion in the sense that there's an ongoing war in Ukraine taking place, an illegal invasion of Russia into Ukraine. This has a very big pivotal negative result, not only to Europe and to the neighboring countries, but also into the world, because we are now seeing another yet division between West and East, and we're very much wondering what is going to take place through the very next months. But in order to do so, we have invited, on behalf of Strategy International, two of the main experts, including also myself, as utilizing the powers that be as head not only of Strategy International, but also as an associate professor at Neapolis University in Paphos in Cyprus. And I'm very glad to say that Strategy International is now a year old. We have gone a very good way forward. We're looking very much doing many things to come, but in order to complete our visions and our objectives, we need to be very punctual. So we're going very stable on our pace, and the importance of a lot of great things are yet to come and to be done by Strategy International, one of which is our webinar series. In this regard, allow me to present my two colleagues, dear friends. We have Ambassador Gela Beshwashvili, who's also a member of Strategy International. And Ambassador Gela has been having many years of experience, besides the fact that it is he comes from a neighboring country to both Ukraine and Russia, but he also has a very strong background, including also a political life, as being amongst them as Minister of Defense of Georgia. And this is very few of the things that I'm saying, Ambassador Gela, about yourself. And also my dear friend, Mark Voyager, who's also an associate professor at the American University in Kiev. We've been very good friends. We know each other since, I think, 2011. And I can assure you that Mark is not only a key expert and an empirical knowledge expert, but also a key person that plays a pivotal role in both the training and educating Ukrainians in Ukraine, but also living this war. And he will also speak out of his experience. And Mark is also part of Strategy International with regards to his expertise. And we're going to have the opportunity to start first with Mark, and Mark will be able to give us some first information. Just for logistical purposes, I will ask both speakers to keep as we discussed with regard to time schedule, so we can have the opportunity to receive further questions. What is going to happen is that I'm going to give the floor to Mark, then Mark will give the floor back to me, and then I'm going to give it to Ambassador Gela. And then I'm going to be as a last speaker. Basically, I'm going to be summarizing or completing some of both of your talks. And then this will follow a Q&A session. In this Q&A session, ladies and gentlemen, you will all have the opportunity to make your own questions, as long as you raise your hand so I can give you the floor to you. Please keep yourselves into mute on all times, and please avoid making any kind of comments while our speakers speak, out of courtesy. My dear friend Mark, the floor is yours. You can share your screen as you requested. Please, the floor is yours, and thank you very much again for joining this series of webinars of Strategy International. Mark?
Yes, Marius, thank you. My dear friend, Filimu, thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's always a pleasure, of course, to participate in our joint seminars, but also it's an honor to share this participation opportunity with so many eminent speakers. I've already we've spoken with Ambassador Gela. I believe back in March, mid-March, we had this conference, and with some others. So again, it's great to see you. And today, what I want to discuss with you, I know we have about 15 or 17 minutes. You asked me to stick to this time schedule. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay. Can you? Yeah, can you see it now? Is it? Yeah, do I need to? All right, okay. So what I'm gonna talk to you in the 15 minutes or so that I have is what I call the failure of Putin's hybrid blitzkrieg against Ukraine. And I am moving straight to what we in the US military like to call the bluff, or the bottom line first. The point here is that Putin really started or launched the wrong type of war at the wrong time with the wrong forces and against the wrong country. So I'm going to explain in the, throughout my presentation what I mean by that. First of all, the Russian propaganda, the Kremlin keeps talking about this war, keeps calling it with the bizarre name, special military operation. Of course, the purpose here is that they would not admit that they're at war, so they won't be forced to announce a general mobilization of the Russian population. But also, obviously, with so many accusations of war crimes, they want to try to somehow counter this and say, hey, we were not at war, it's just some minor operation. Now, the special military operation, in my opinion, can effectively be described, if you use Western terms, the Western terminologies, as a hybrid blitzkrieg. What I mean by that is that Putin was counting on really taking over Kiev, as you probably all know, in about 3 days. That was the initial plan. And yesterday or a couple of days ago, Rusi in London report, which also states that the plans to take over the entire country involve 10 days. So 3 days for Kiev, 10 days for the largest country of Europe. So for all intents and purposes, the closest that we have in history would be in the Blitzkrieg campaign that was launched by Hitler's forces back in the Second World War, but with one particular difference, of course, that this is a hybrid campaign, and I'll describe in further detail what I mean by that. The main point is, of course, also that in fact Putin and his forces have failed miserably on all accounts when it comes to this so-called special military operation. Why? I would argue Russia overestimated its forces, but also the world overestimated Russia's forces. And it has become clear that the Russian army is the so-called Potemkin formation, of Potemkin army. In the 18th century, there was this Count Potemkin, the lover of Empress Catherine the Great, who would create those fake facades, beautiful facades of otherwise rotten villages or very poor areas to kind of create the impression that it's something new and developed and modern. Well, that's exactly what the Russian army is. There's a lot of fanfare, a lot of parades, a lot of publications in all sorts of journals talking about doctrines, about how they're rearming, reforming, and whatnot. It seems that not only Russia overestimated its capabilities, but we in the West, many of us probably also took many of what the Russians are publishing at face value, and that was, I guess, the reality is quite different. And of course, I would say, of course, the Kremlin underestimated Ukraine's ability to defend itself, but also many in the West thought that Ukraine may actually fall quite quickly. And therefore, this is not only, of course, a failure of theory and a failure of imagination, but it had direct negative implications in the fact that we did not provide heavy weapons from the very beginning. I guess the logic, the rationale was that, well, if they collapse, if they are taken over, why should we repeat the Afghanistan fiasco? So this misperception born out of the precipitous collapse of the Afghan government in September of 2021. So perceptions become a reality in international relations theory. In this case, misperception became a reality check, both for the Russians, for the Kremlin, but also for the West in many ways. Now, when I spoke about all these beautiful models, many of you have heard of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. I personally call it the Gerasimov model. In short, this is the model presented by the Russian Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov, that supposedly describes the world of warfare in the 21st century that's dominated by hybrid warfare, not by purely conventional tools and methods and active actions, but by hybrid, which means they incorporate many non-military elements. Of course, information warfare, lawfare, we have spoken about that, political warfare, cyber, intelligence, the economy, energy, everything that you hear about and read about in the news. This is part of this Russian model. This has failed again miserably. None of this has been able to help the Russians, take over, especially to take over Ukraine in a very quick fashion. One of Gerasimov's subordinates later on started developing this other doctrine that's more purely military. They call it integrated forces groupings. That means that Russian forces can be sent to a certain area, or a country like in Syria, primarily advisors, primarily special forces, intel operators and communications specialists. And then around them, they start gathering local forces, local militias, local recruits, sometimes criminal elements, sometimes, ethnic militias and others. And then they try to build this massive force out of a small core of Russian forces. This has also failed. We saw what happened in the Donbass. Ultimately, unwilling soldiers just won't fight. I mean, you can create all sorts of, innovative models and theoretical constructs, and they ultimately, the reality check, the fog of war and the realities of this brutal war effectively result in the collapse of all of these otherwise beautifully looking theoretical ideas. Also, Ukraine used the period after the first attack of 2014 until February 24th to actually prepare for this coming war. Apparently, Russia didn't. There was a lot of hubris. I mean, hubris, of course, is an ancient Greek word. Back in the day when America was in Afghanistan and Iraq, everybody spoke about the American hubris, the American empire, how arrogant, the Americans we have become. Well, I guess the Russians are not immune to this hubris, and it has failed them again miserably. They thought of the Ukrainians as, incompetent, as disorganized, as weak, as cowardly, that they would run away and leave their country. Well, it didn't happen. The Ukrainians actually had prepared for training programs with NATO, with Canadian, British, American military advisors. For years, we have been helping them improve their tactics, their operational skills, master new types of weapons. And so ultimately, they were quite good. When the war started, they had developed this very flexible maneuver opportunity capabilities, and those were actually quite effective, very effective against the old Soviet style fighting style that the Russians have. Obviously, Russia, lost those 8 years just resting on their laurels, to use another, Greco-Roman, analogy of the laurels and the victors in war. What the war has shown also is that the HIMARS, this long-range artillery provided by the U.S., but also other similar systems, is really the new god of war. If in ancient Greece you had Ares, or in ancient Rome you had Mars, now HIMARS is actually the new Mars of the 21st century. So we need to be sending more to Ukraine. And ultimately, Putin, what I'm arguing here, is he has really very few options left, almost none of purely military nature. In other words, it's difficult to imagine, with the capabilities that he has, what the Russians can do in purely military terms to actually turn the course of the war. Unfortunately, what they have at their disposal is still substantial capabilities of targeting civilians through mostly missile attacks against civilian areas, against buildings, residential buildings, against electric power plants, etc. Facilities to make the life miserable And then, of course, the idea is to try to push another wave of refugees from Ukraine into Europe, and just like they did in Syria after 2015. And with this, to threaten the European consensus, European and Western consensus as a whole, in supporting Ukraine. And of course, there's always this threat of nuclear terrorism that kind of looms on the horizon, that Putin, although he, of course, I don't think he's willing to use serious strategic nuclear weapons or even tactical ones. He can still resort to the use of dirty bombs that contaminate a large area, that can potentially take the nuclear contamination west into Europe or into the Black Sea area, or they can do something to damage the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, which is Zaporizhia. So these options are still very much on the table for Putin. So now I'm going to run really a minute a slide. I want to show you some basic facts. Now, Russia so far has lost, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, as of yesterday, over 90,000 killed in action. That's not the wounded are about 3 times more at least. So we're talking about easily 400,000 altogether, maybe even 500,000 when you combine all the killed in action, wounded, and all sorts of other personnel that has suffered during the war. Just to put this in a historical context, the entire Soviet Union, with a population of over 240 million, lost about 15,000 over the course of 10 years in Afghanistan. So now we're talking about less than 10 months. So less than 10 months, the result is 90,000. 10 years in Afghanistan, 15,000. I mean, you can do the math yourself. It's a gigantic loss. I mean, of human life, of course, but this is also this threatens to create serious social pressure on Putin and his regime when those people start going back to Russia and asking questions about or of course their families and their friends and their social networks. This is a map that shows how things are currently. Obviously, the blue arrows is where the Ukrainians have expelled the Russian forces, and then the red arrows are where there's still fighting going on. Obviously, in the Donbass, in the east, in the south, around the Azov Sea, and then out of Crimea on basically the left bank of the Dnipro River. Now, what were the Russians thinking before they started the war? The CSIS had excellent kind of maps that kind of showed even a month before the war what the potential avenues of advance would be. The program minimum, is, if I can call it, is the taking over, the first one, the taking over of the Azov Sea, expanding out of Crimea, potentially trying to isolate Odessa, move into Bessarabia, and then potentially connect with Transnistria. This would have been the more realistic plan. I mean, I personally expected something along those lines, of course, combined with bombings against Kiev, missile attacks, maybe terrorist attacks, social pressure, economic pressure, all the hybrid tools. But this was what I really thought that they would kind of focus on, the Russian force. And of course, the last one is this program maximum, which sounds unrealistic now or even before. But what they really tried to do is actually portrayed or described in Figure 2, where they really tried to take over not only Kiev, but expand from out of Donbass and take the major industrial cities, the heartland here, Zaporizhia, and then Dnieper, and then into Poltava and beyond to the Dnipro River. Pretty much take everything that's called the left bank Ukraine, the entire industrial base. And again, we know that they failed. Now, when I spoke about this hybrid component, the Russians, since Putin came to power, but especially Gerasimov was appointed chief of staff, they started thinking seriously about the future of warfare. And of course, the future, is connected to the past. I mean, they have this strong historical sense of how things were. Putin came to power in '99. first, of course, and then became president in 2000. This was the year when Milosevic was taken down as a result of this NATO campaign. This was a formative experience for his people because they saw how through a campaign of a couple of months that was based on mostly on air operations, airstrikes, and of course on social pressure from the protesters against Milosevic, that a regime that was friendly to Russia collapsed. And then of course came Iraq, of course all the Arab Spring, and also sort of regime started falling. Obviously the war in Syria. So in their mind, the West was doing something that was quick, relatively easy. I mean, regimes would be toppled in weeks and at most a couple of months. So they really wanted to replicate that. And so this Gerasimov model really showed how, hey, if we use political pressure and all the other tools combined with high precision weapons, precision guided munitions, and then the special forces and all the cool stuff that they kind of imagined that they had, we can actually repeat that. And of course, they failed in Georgia. In 2008, their performance against Georgia, which is of course a smaller country, even there they failed. But obviously, those 14 years they did not achieve anything more substantial in terms of reform. But in their mind, they had this great model where they can replicate the success of the West. And so, the point, as I said, that I'm making here is that this dream, this imaginary hybrid blitzkrieg, it was only a theoretical construct, and on the below the surface, you had this really Soviet, rotten system, unreformed army, low combat morale. Obviously, all the brutality that the Russian soldiers have inflicted on the population. So, this beautiful surface doesn't match at all with what they were doing. So initially, of course, they thought that they could not only take over Ukraine, but take it over with a limited number of forces that they had. Why? Because Putin wanted the people to be able to, in Russia, to be able to sit in front of the TV and watch those beautiful pictures, just like he thought the Americans were sitting back in 2003 or in 1999, just watching the American professional soldiers taking down Milosevic and then Saddam and many others. So he really wanted to replicate this, what he viewed as the Western success against those regimes. Again, he failed. There was this excessive amount of secrecy. Even the soldiers didn't know where they were going. They did not provide them with enough, obviously, even food, munitions, anything that they needed, only for a couple of days, really. And so the elites were unprepared. Before the war, many of my colleagues were thinking, well, if they know that such a big war is coming, why is the Russian economic elite not transferring billions across to safe havens across the world? They didn't know it was coming, and so now they're suffering together with everybody, because they obviously a lot of it has been expropriated by in the West. And so this degree of secrecy has really played them a very, very bad joke, let's put it this way. Now, another assumption was, as I mentioned, that not only the Ukrainians will collapse, but that there will be a strong fifth column within Ukraine, especially in Kiev, politicians, local leaders, the economic elite that would just welcome the Russians. So the only thing you have to do is just roll with the tanks, and the people will greet them with flowers. There will be a liberation from some imaginary Nazis, and it will be over in 3 days. Wrong. This evaporated, really, this dream, this fantasy rather, in the first couple of days after the attack. Obviously, the FSB, the Russian intelligence, had been giving totally incorrect information to Putin. The reason is that Putin has surrounded himself with people who tell him what he wants to hear, and it becomes this so-called echo chamber. So there's no one really to give him the actual realistic information, and as a result, they would feed him things that he wants to hear, and that's where this type of behavior, this type of policy leads to a catastrophic failure. Now, quickly, obviously, the Russian forces were pushed away from Kiev in the first couple of months toward the springtime. But then the real big operation was when they liberated Kharkiv Oblast, and it happened because of two things: excellent, of course, tactics on the ground, but also secrecy and disinformation against the Russians, whereby the Russians thought the Ukrainian attack was coming against Kherson in the south. That was back in September. Instead, so the Russians thought that the Ukrainians are going to hit here. They amassed forces in the south. The Ukrainians hit in the northeast and liberated the entire Kharkiv Oblast. The front line collapsed of the Russian front line collapsed, and they took over Izium and all the other important cities. This was the first major after after the withdrawal from Kiev, but this showed to the world that the Russians are not invincible. And then comes, of course, today, the situation today as we know it, and what we have is again it's a reversal of September. Actually the Ukrainians hit in the south finally 2 months after they hit the Kharkiv region, and they took over the right bank area of the Dnieper River, and now we see that Kherson is obviously back in Ukrainian hands. This is excellent maps from the Institute for the Study of War. I'm not going to go over these, but anywhere you look, the Ukrainians are advancing, the Russians are retreating. Now, some of the problems with that is, of course, with such a rapid advance, the Russians have been preparing, putting up defenses on the left bank of the river. So the Ukrainians have to make some hard choices. If you're going to advance, are you going to be able to sustain lower losses? Because obviously, if the Russians are prepared with several echelons of defense, then the advancing forces, which is Ukraine, they would suffer losses. So this is the decision that the Ukrainian Strategic Command has to make. But I hear and see reports from other cities in the area that the Russians actually trying to withdraw members of the local administration, the collaborators, even from around Zaporizhia, and maybe withdraw in the direction of Melitopolis. And so there is this feeling that maybe they're trying to withdraw and create a more manageable, a more defensible position. So in this case, of course, the Ukrainians potentially can advance even here, but then the question is, they can actually seal off the access to Crimea to the south, and then it's a matter of time. Crimea will become an island, really, surrounded by Ukrainian forces. Not going to go over these very in detail. What this says is that the Ukrainians reformed after the Soviet Union collapsed. They had the same Soviet-style army as the Russians did, just poorer, with less money, less equipment. But then under the training, the tutelage of NATO and Western military advisors, they actually changed, and so they created those smaller units that were following standards, and most of all what we call mission command. You give the lower ranking commanders a task, you don't care how they perform it, so you don't macromanage them. Whereas on the Russian side, what you have is nobody wants to take the initiative. Everybody is afraid to make the wrong move because they'll be punished. As a result, generals have to come down from Moscow or from the headquarters commands to actually give orders to troops at really low level. As a result, they get exposed and get killed. I mean, there were a large number of generals who were killed just because they were so close to the front line, because personally they had to push, like in the ancient times when you had the chieftains, the army leaders had to go and fight on the front line to motivate the troops. This is very primitive, but that's how it worked there. And as a result, all these successful operational improvements in their arts and tactics, the Ukrainians were able to prevail and launch counterattacks. So you see here some examples of their operations in around Kharkiv, and there's analysis of small mobile groups moving and encircling the enemy, whereas the Russians are, again, static, Soviet-style static forces that they cannot take the initiative. And of course, the Ukrainians have this Western-style sergeants corps, so they'll act as the intermediary between and the soldiers, and they're able to actually influence the soldiers positively, train them, something that the Russians don't have, and now they're paying because of this. Words on the Black Sea, on the situation in the sea. To use the biblical analogy, it looks like David versus Goliath in the Black Sea. Obviously, the ratio, as you can see here, is 1 to 12 in favor of Russia in terms of ships, in terms of missiles, and all the systems. And initially, the Russians thought the Black Sea is going to be Mare Nostrum, like the Romans used to think of the Mediterranean as our sea. Well, the Azov at this point is Mare Nostrum for the Russians, but not the Black Sea, because the Ukrainians very early in the game were able to hit with missiles, with surface to sea missiles, the flagship, the Moscow, the flagship of the Russian Black Fleet, sink it. A tremendous humiliation for not only the Russian Navy but for Putin himself. As a result, the Russian Navy has been hiding either in the ports here in Crimea or even back in Russia in Novorossiysk, and is unable to operate the way in a way that they could project dominance and hegemony throughout the Black Sea. And the question is how to lose one's military dominance to a nation that is always almost without a navy, and of course not completely without a navy, but it doesn't have the resources that the Russians have. A tremendous humiliation, tremendous blow to the morale of the Russians. Some of the key lessons: the only thing that the Russians have left is the launching of the Caliber out of the submarines, again against the civilian targets and infrastructure targets. Nothing that they hit has a real military implication. It's not gonna, because the Ukrainian forces, as I mentioned, they operate in smaller units, they're dispersed. There's nothing you can do to hit them all with those missiles, but you can hit the big power plants and deprive the people of their electricity. Also air and naval, of course. Ultimately, because of this Black Sea situation, there has to be a NATO, a Western strategy to implement something like a joint security strategy. And of course, Georgia here is important, of course, NATO countries like Bulgaria and Romania, but of course, Turkey, it has a specific role, specific views in that regard. But ultimately, what happens in the Black Sea doesn't stay in the Black Sea. So because of the implications of this war, the grain crisis, that has a tremendous impact, negative impact on Africa and the Middle East, the global South. And so this situation demands a overall strategy. Ultimately, the only thing the Russians now have is the numerical advantage looking into the future. Yes, they can try to muster more forces, they can bring more recruits. They don't have the money, the funding to provide all the modern equipment for those. These will be used again as cannon fodder. They will be thrown against and they will die by the thousands. This is going to be their fate. But I guess Putin, his resort is convicts, people taken from jails, people with different offenses, just as cannon fodder, just to overwhelm the Ukrainians with their sheer numbers. Ultimately, for the future, after Ukraine wins, because it will win with Western aid, they can become this porcupine, this animal with those powerful thorns, into this Israeli strategy. When you have this massive enemy surrounding you on all sides, you have to create a powerful reserve force. We, the West, are gonna provide more modern weapons. With talking already about potentially air fighters, F-16s potentially, and Patriot missiles, and of course the training by Western forces is going on. So Ukraine will become really this porcupine that will discourage Russia from ever trying again, regardless of whether Putin stays in power or not. This will be, I think, the situation in the future. I know I've overshot my time probably by 10 minutes. So Marius, apologies for this lengthy expose. I'll be happy to take any questions or any comments on what I.
Thank you very much, Mark. No, it was actually very interesting, and we we let you go ahead with this because it's actually always interesting what you're saying, exactly for the reasons that I said in the beginning of the personality that you are and the expertise that you have with regard to these issues. So thank you very much, Mark. Allow me to give the floor now to Ambassador Gela Bashashvili. Mark did indeed mention Georgia as a key country. There's no better person, uh, scientifically, business level, political, or any other level to, for Ambassador Gela to be there and talk to us and tell us what his experience tells him out of the whole situation. And also, Ambassador Gela, utilizing this opportunity that I have, tell us what is the impact vis-a-vis Georgia's national security, if that helps you. Ambassador Gela, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Sure. And first of all, congratulations, and it's a pleasure to participate in the first of series of webinars of Strategy International. I think it's we need to celebrate the success of the organization. It's already in a year. Time flies. So let me really let me congratulate Mark with a very interesting presentation. I will use some of your points, Mark, in trying to focus more on the question why. What led Russian leadership to make a terrible mistake by invading Ukraine? Because in the summary of your presentation, one may see strategic mistake with a lot of consequences that some of them are visible, some of them will be visible very soon for Russia. And one may ask the question, why? What was the root cause of the illegal, unprovoked, brutal invasion of the neighbor? So let me give you the thoughts of not an expert, but a practitioner, rather, who participating in lengthy negotiations on behalf of Georgian government with Russia on the same issues. And actually the root causes of invasion of Georgia in 2008 are quite similar of the root causes that pushed Russian leadership to make the strategic mistake in February 2022. So why the Russian leadership decided to invade Ukraine? And here I would like to borrow some of the ideas from the Zbigniew Brzezinski in his very famous book, The Grand Chessboard, which is, I think, in my view, is a table book now. What is happening in Ukraine? I personally talked to Zbigniew 20, 25 years ago when he introduced this book to the audience. And one of these fundamentals that he found was that paranoia of Russian leadership to reinstall the Soviet Union, to reinstall the empire, was behind all the planning and actions of the Russian leadership since 1999. You mentioned 1999 because in 1999, that when President Putin came to power, the West and the neighbors were looking with a great deal of hope, actually, for the post-Yeltsin period of Russia, hoping for the change. There were some good signs from the beginning when there were some rapprochements with the West, some attempts from the Russian leadership to figure out what's the role of Russia in a Western in a Eurasia, what's the role of Russia in their relationship with the West. But then it was very, very clear, and that clarity was mostly with the neighbors, because we understand by skin how this big animal with the borders from ocean to ocean operates. What's the mindset behind their decisions? So as Brzezinski in his book said, without Ukraine, That's fundamentals from his book. Without Ukraine, Russia cannot be empire. So knowing that Russia started sometime in my view, it started in 2003, 2004, when we felt that Russia is becoming aggressive in their attitude toward the neighbors. The Georgia was a first case because Ukraine was always in minds of Russian leadership to be a centerpiece for their plan grandiose to reinstall the to reinstall the empire. Let's put it this way. But the things evolved in Georgia first in 2003, Rose Revolution, and in the years after this Rose Revolution showed the case of successful transformation of the post-Soviet Republic into the modern society. You know, the feasible results of the reforms, visible results of the democracy in action, created some kind of a hope for others in that region that it is possible. It is possible within a fairly short period of time to transform the society. And we realized immediately that created a lot of concern in Kremlin, because successful Georgia, democratic Georgia, setting up examples of good governance, electronic governance, the services provided to the citizens, represented a threat to the project. And the project was to bring those republics back to the empire and reinstall this the union that, from the Russians' point of view, was something that was absolutely necessary for their long-term existence as a big, powerful country, being a player in a global arena. So be something resembling the USSR with less resources, of course, and something. So Georgia was a first test case. So the Georgia was the first test case, and that's why the tension have been rising from 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, with a series of events, provocations. So finally, the Georgia was dragged into the situation when 2008 August happened, quick invasion of Georgia. They were just lasted for 5 days. And what happened there and aftermath was very, very weak. I would say very mild reaction of the West to what happened. We try to be vocal. We try to be very outspoken about the root causes of that. So what I'm saying now, we've been saying this privately and publicly as a government from every podium that we used, but we were not heard. So our voice was not strong enough. What happened afterward? And by the way, from the purely military perspective, I would say the Russians, the first ring bell of their military capability failures was during the Georgian-Russian war in 2008. And Mark is absolutely right. But they learned some of the lessons out of it, yes, but not all of them. So that this inability of the West to be very strong in opposing the Russian plan grandiose. And by the way, no politicians in Europe, in Berlin, in Paris, even in Washington, believe that the Russians are up to reinstalling the Soviet Union and reinstalling the empire. A lot of people were saying that it is a mission impossible. It's and so on and so forth. So then another very epic date happened. That was annexation of Crimea. An annexation of Crimea, I think, created some sort of a notion of impunity in a Russian regime, because the reaction again was not subordinate to what happened. So the Russians believed that, and by the way, they created a lot of illusions about their own military capabilities, because annexation of Crimea happened very quickly. They were very proud of their a quick blitzkrieg operation in Crimea. You remember the situation and situational analysis at that time, that there was almost no resistance from the Ukraine. At that time, Ukraine was right after Yanukovych left the country, so there was not a legitimate government in place, and so on and so forth. So a lot of reasons why. So this situation with annexation of Crimea, and of course afterwards there were some sanctions imposed, some better reactions from the West on this annexation, but still it was not enough. So this impunity and a false impression and false beliefs in their might, including military might, created the strong grounds for Russian leadership to prepare another invasion, and it's had been prepared for some years. And I would like to mention here something that I saw on a map that Mark showed in his presentation. That was Exhibit 1, when it was a program minimum of Russia, and program minimum of Russia was to cut Ukraine from the Black Sea. So these four regions: Donetsk, Odessa, Nikolaev, and it basically leads to the border of Moldova. That was a plan of Novorossiya. And I wrote an article on our website, Strategy International, about the concept of Novorossiya, because the readers and the people need to understand that the Novorossiya project is not a new one. Novorossiya project has its own history. They used the Novorossiya terminology even in their statements. So that's not something new. So they had in mind to create this Novorossiya project within the Ukraine, and they needed of course the pretext. When the mild reaction, still I call it mild reaction of the West on an annexation of Crimea, created this ground for Russia to prepare a new invasion, then the calculations and miscalculations started to play. And here is a great example, Mark's presentation, what kind of miscalculations Russians made in their preparation for the invasion. And I'm not going to talk about this. This is a series of failures, underestimation of your opponent, and overestimation of your own resources, of your own capabilities, and so on and so forth. But a root cause for everything that led to the invasion is the understanding of President Putin and his team that they were losing time in bringing Ukraine back. So I think they realized that Ukraine is quite different than it was in 2014. So going back to the presentation of Mark, when you saw this period of 2014 and 2022, this time has been used very wisely and very effectively by Ukrainians in order to increase their military capabilities, make stronger institutions, civil society movements. So Ukraine was becoming different than perceived by Russians. So I think this momentum also affected their their decision to invade, which I call a strategic mistake. It was not provoked by Ukraine. It was provoked by Russian mentality of master-client relationship. So the client was becoming outside of the control of master. That's how I would have described the situation before February 2022. Invasion happened. We saw very clearly during the presentation of Mark where we are now, where the Russia is now. Let me tell you that I don't see, and I agree completely with Mark, with all who are saying and it's not a wishful thinking. I don't see Russia winning this war. I don't know the formula of winning. I don't know the formula of losing, but they are not winning. By not winning in this brutal war, again, I borrow from the Brzezinski. And he said it 20, 25 years ago, if Russia will, by force, engage Ukraine and lose, Ukraine will change Russia. So the formula already, and this is my hypothesis, that's what I actually believe, the failure of Russia, which is a fact, in Ukraine, in the long run, will change society in Russia. So we're not going to deal with the same Russia as now, and regardless of regime. And I agree with Mark, who said, the Putin's regime is just a matter of time. Any regime after post-war in Russia will have an absolutely different situation, and Ukrainian war will affect it. And I say it from the positive perspective. I mean, it will positively change Russia. That's what I think. It will take time, but reconstruction of Ukraine, success of Ukraine, in which the West will invest and must invest, will create a platform for a fundamental long-term changes in Russia. So this is I would say somehow strategic predicament, which is not my predicament, but it's Zbigniew Brzezinski. That is a table book for this conflict. I brought to you for your considerations. I will not go further into the details, but I try to show you the root causes, where we were, what affected the Russian decision to invade, because the consequences for Russia are severe. And we can spend hours talking about negative consequences and losses of Russia. There are no gains for Russia. That's a fact. There are all losses. They have lost their strengths in every aspect of international life or internal. So I will stop here, Marius, and I will be ready to answer any questions that will appear.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. This was a very, as you said, very empirical knowledge with regards to exactly what is happening or what is taking place. Allow me to just say and add a few words myself as a third speaker. I'm not going to take too long. But what I wanted to say, and I think it's really important, is that in various books, when I was reading about Russian foreign policy, and I think I've seen with a lot of other scientists, very few of them, but this made sense, like Bobolo, for example, who was talking about the Russian foreign policy. He was saying at some point that we do not think like the Russians think because we have a very Western mentality in orientation. And I think this is the case because even I remember in my trips, both in Ukraine, in Eastern Ukraine, where we now have the war-like situation, but also when I visited Moscow and I gave several speeches to Migimo and goes on and on and on. One of the things that I realized is that they are taking extremely serious the historical value of the Russian culture in the extension to a geographical sense, meaning that they cared very much about which areas they would take and for which purpose. They would care exactly where the rivers would be. They would care exactly where the seas would lead, the rivers would lead into the seas. They would care about the scientific or cultural aspect that makes Russians being Russians. Actually, it's a question about the Kievan Rus. And it has many, many, many dimensions that can lead from politics to society, to identity, to language, even to religion. And, you know, one thing that we also tend to forget is the schism that basically took place of the Ukrainian church by becoming self-headed, which is now acknowledged by the Ecumenical Patriarchy in Constantinople, which was not accepted by Cyril of Moscow, because his attempts are quite different and more diverse, where he wants the Ecumenical Patriarchy to be more associated with the Muscovite, if you want, policy. So everything goes together and everything is blended together. And I think that in 2007 and 8, what happened in Georgia was just a small idea of what the Russians actually wanted to do. I think they were testing the ground because of how fast they withdrew from Georgia. It was a political mistake. It was clear that Georgia was going into the West. Also, probably because they do not think alike. They have invested into their interests, both in Georgia, but also in the Caucasus, the other countries in the Caucasus altogether. And that also included Ukraine. Now, for me, the problem, the real problem is about Ukraine is that it's big. And because it is big, there is a diversity of thinking and mentality between West and East Ukraine. And the interests are diverse. That was one. Number two, what Putin basically invested into was the level of poverty that existed in the eastern part of Ukraine, which he actually made sure that that continues, because he knew that eventually he would utilize this to create this instability within Ukraine, so he can push and showcase that Ukraine was not made to be in the West, although they decided that they want to be in the West quite early, like in 2009. And the 2009 was the immediate reaction of Ukraine doing this, what it did to Georgia, by the way, not only because of Crimea and the presence of the Russian troops in the Black Sea, and it goes on and on and on, but also because they would realize, the Russian, I think, realized the power that could Ukraine have in a post era, if you want, 20 years onwards, considering how big it is, the potential that it has, the manpower that it has, all these factories that will be renovated and under which conditions they will be renovated or be used by the West to the extent that it is. It is of no coincidence, for example, that the Russian president or the Russian foreign minister or even politicians in the lower or higher Duma are utilizing a lot of elements to somehow proceed or perceive through international media that the Americans or the Europeans, when they invest in Ukraine, they're investing wrong to them, and look what they're doing, and it's a scandal, and it goes on and on. No, it's called investment, and it's called return of investment. And it is called return of investment because Ukraine feeds Europe, and because Ukraine always fed Europe. And we saw that during World War II, and the attempt of who controls Ukraine can control Europe, because you can feed your troops, you can feed a lot of industries, and it goes on and on and on. In fact, if Ukraine was not so important, then the industry, from the basic commodities to the services provided and so on, would not create such a problem to Europe if Ukraine would not have been so important and so serious. Because if we dig inside to see what sort of factories, what sort of industry Ukraine had, and which were the clients and who were they feeding, you will understand the importance of Ukraine as in the business level world. Now, energy-wise and energy security perspective, it is only normal that was the leverage of Russia during the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century vis-a-vis Europe. They were selling cheap. The Europeans were buying. They bought so much that eventually they figured out that we don't need to utilize our own resources, and we should use the cheap gas. I remember the price was at some point was 0.22 on the gas on a euro. So you can imagine how different the price was vis-a-vis Europeans, and the Europeans felt comfortable with it. In return, the Russians wanted to have a more active role, let's say, in Central Asia in the war against terror, where in Afghanistan and NATO forces were collaborating with Russia with regards to the fight against the Taliban. And not only that, but also in other terrorist activities that were taking place, if you want, in the Asian, in the Central Asian region. No wonder that while the war in Ukraine is taking place, we have forgotten what is taking place in northern Syria or in northern Iraq and so on and so forth. And even until today, there were forces, Russian and American, working side by side, supposedly to counter ISIS. So what the Russians actually figured out is that I believe, and it's my personal opinion, that the Europeans had what can be seen as a potential leak, like a hole where they can actually manipulate and go through this case. Second thing is that the Russians were building a case against Ukraine since 2009, exactly, from the moment that both Georgia and Ukraine raised both the European flags and the NATO flags as potential members to be, because they had to inherit the standards, and goes on and on and on. This game led to 2011, where they requested the increase of the Russian presence in Crimea with their military forces. In 2012, they requested again the presence of more military forces, and obviously the Ukrainian government was rejecting that on the basis that listen, we like you, you're a neighbor, but we're going towards the west, and this is the end, and this is what it is. In fact, there was a reflection. There was a reflection towards politicians that either aspired to be more European oriented or more Russian oriented, and the fight was humongous in this area. Now take it into a very local area like Donetsk, where you had a lot of local interests and very big entrepreneurs and business people that actually invested a lot, both in Mariupol and Donetsk and Luhansk and so on and so forth, to build airports, to build football teams like Shakhtar FC, for example. And they invested into the locality to become more internationalized. And here comes Putin to destroy this within a blink of an eye, because they didn't feel that the actual culture card was there, the resources, the language skill set, and so on and so forth. So what did they do? They started attempting to split people in between Russophiles, if you want, and those that would be more in the West, while the West was more acquainted into making sure that, if you remember, in a parallel universe between 2012 and 2017, we live economic crisis, we live elements that are taking place in the South, in the Central and Eastern Europe. We're talking about enlargement processes and who should be a member of the EU. What is the future of NATO going to look like? More process. We're trying to opening up with the rest of the world with regard to trade. Imagine that only the European Union with Mercosur agreement in the Asia region took 20 years, where they took a decision in 2019. So the attention of the Europeans was more economic, more trade, more oriented into the European values, the future of the Balkans, of the Western Balkans. It goes on and on and on, while the Russians were contemplating on how they would invade Ukraine. I think, and with this I will stop, I think the Russians had a plan against Ukraine, and I also think that this is not the last of the things that we have seen from Russia. Ukraine is not the only one, and if if Russia wins from some reason, you can understand that there will be a potential domino effect in other areas, in other places, that Russia would like to destabilize, because they live out of this instability, because this is the only way that it can be answered, whether Russia is a power, is a peripheral power, or if it belongs, if you want, to the European powers or the big powers. It seems the irony of this thing is that although Russia believes that it is a global power and therefore it should always be a global power, for some reason, it also wants to be a European power. and somebody has to tell them that this is not the way to achieve European mentality, values, and ethics by doing war. Because now what they have done is so potentially bad. I'm not talking for generations to come, that even if Putin goes away, there are going to be so many cases, legal by nature, and things that are coming to being, that the hate that they suddenly created, also of Russians within, probably within the borders between Ukraine or Georgia and so on and so forth, that the Russians now feel they don't know what to feel. Even if they were peace people, people of peace, and they didn't want to be involved in this, suddenly they are involved into a non-ending situation. And mind you, just the last thing, I think that the war is not going to end real soon. And I think we should be ready for more active elements that we're going to see from the Russian side. But I also believe that the negotiations will eventually somehow lead into conclusion between 2026 and 27, where I think there will be a lot of, it's a bit ironic what I'm going to say, so I don't want to be misunderstood, but they're going to be tired, and politically and militarily, and things are not going to go well for them, while also Ukraine will be in a status mode that will need to eventually make the other side stop. So basically sit down on the negotiation table, because there is the train of the European Union, which is actually coming. And that includes vast investment and reconstruction of the country, which is going to be very tough, and it's going to take many, many years to come. I hope that peace prevails somehow, and I hope that logic prevails, because what we also do not understand in our part of the world is that this can have a really negative effect to us, to our regional foreign policy, that can spill over at any time. And one thing is for sure, we live in volatile periods where actors may want to be higher in the rankings and showcase their abilities in the international community. But I am wondering whether the international community is ready to change. And I think not, because this kind of things take us back and do not take us forward into the things that we attempted and we thought that they were going to be, which means the century of the future. So thank you very much for this, for these three talks, both to Mark and to Ambassador Gela. Allow me to say, Robert, I see your hand is up and standing. I'll give you the floor first. Just let us know who you are, and just please tell us to whom this question is for, and I'll give the floor immediately to the one who is to answer. Thank you.
My video is not working for some reason. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank for all of the very interesting comments. I have a particular question directed principally to Ambassador Gela, taking up on your last point, where you endorsed, or you made a reprise of the hypothesis of Brzezinski. And as everyone knows, it's a pattern in Russian history that loss of foreign war leads to reform at home. And it falls also into this idea falls also into that pattern. My question is concerning, and I add that my perspective is not just 3 to 5 years, but also 20 to 25 years. I invite you to consider. I'm certain that you have heard of, if not have a deeper familiarity with, the recent work by Janusz Bugajski of the Jamestown Foundation, who has published a book indicating that the Russian Federation will not survive in its current form and will be subject to separatist, independentist movements, as it was actually, as the empire was from 1917 to 1922, and has even reoccurred in the early 1990s, particularly during the crisis between Yeltsin and the Russian Duma, when he was shelled the building of the Russian legislature and was acclaimed by the West as a great Democrat for doing so. So my question to Ambassador Gela is, and just to review for those who may not be may not know that although the ambassador certainly knows that already there have been reprise of separatist movements in the North Caucasus. Historically, there's also a move to increase the local activism of the Idel Ural which six subjects of the Russian Federation, largely Muslim, including Bashkortostan and Kalmykia. There is an economic potential in the east for Primorsky Krai and Khabarovsk Krai in particular, but also Sakhalin and Kamchatka, to rupture. They have an independent economic base, and the idea has been argued that there is a potential, given their important economic local base, including oil and gas production and several ports, that they could, under the proper circumstances and under a certain leadership, engage in autonomous foreign policy links with Japan and South Korea, and in this way break off from the Russian Federation. So my question to the ambassador is, if you believe that this will not happen, please, and with a perspective of 20 to 25 years, if not sooner, but with this perspective, what are the conditions and the circumstances that will prevent it from happening? That is my question.
Okay, Ambassador.
All right, got it. Very good, very good one. It's actually follows my logic of arguing together with Zbigniew Brzezinski that, and I mentioned it at the end of my presentation, that the Ukraine at the end, because Russia is not winning, Ukraine success will lead, will create a center of magnitude for Russia to change, and this change might lead, most probably will lead to the disintegration that you mentioned. This is a very extreme, and it's in my experience, when we were talking in such terms some years ago with the European, especially Western European politicians, that creates a fear in their eyes how this big country, big Russia, nuclear power can disintegrate. And that's something that still is a fear of decision makers in Europe. It's not an easy process, and it's really a risky process. Disintegration of this country, that is very possible. I would argue that it might happen even earlier than 20, 25 years. And the changes that are inevitable for Russia might and will most probably lead to the disintegration. How, in which forms that will happen, it's difficult to predict now. You rightly pointed out some of the advantageous regions, and there are several who can autonomously develop themselves in a successful economies, being it's Far East or Tatarstan, that is very rich with oil and gas. There are almost no resources in North Caucasus. They are totally 100% in most cases depend on the transfers from Moscow. So there are no natural resources, and that's another headache for all of us in the neighborhood when the Kremlin will be out of the resources, how they are going to sustain governance in those republics that is purely based on a elite, corrupt elite payments from Moscow. There are no jobs in North Ossetia or in any of the republics except of the Chechnya in the North Caucasus. So my point about how it will lead the change, that the Georgia and Ukraine and successful Moldova, these three success stories presented a challenge, presented a threat to the regime in Moscow, because but the power of magnitude of Georgian reform and Georgian case was not enough. and the power of magnitude of Ukraine change will lead to the changes in Russia, definitely, because of the many reasons, because of the size of the country, because of size of population, long border, the people are more or less similar. This is a different nation, but more or less similar mentality. Still, the people in the Russians looking at the successful Ukraine being reconstructed, being different, being successful, will inevitably lead to the change. Your question was what needs to be done, or what should be done to prevent it. I don't know, honestly, and I don't think that they can be prevented. We are at the stage when the Russian strategic mistakes for themselves leads to the situation when the changes in Ukraine and in Russia are almost inevitable. That's what I can see from my perspective as of now.
Okay, thank you. Just to conclude, Mario, so if you'll give me 2 more words, I appreciate very much your reply, and I largely concur, including your view that it may not take 20 to 25 years, and of course it's going to be path dependent. We can't say what will happen. Just to clarify, my question, I posed my question in the way I did as a kind of a devil's advocate, saying this is the null hypothesis, what's going to prevent it? And so I should clarify that I myself individually am not an advocate of the integrity of the Russian Federation if circumstances should conduce to bring about its fragmentation. We all recall how powerless was George H.W. Bush with his Chicken Kiev speech in the late 1980s to maintain the integrity of the Soviet Union. Yes, certainly the West Europeans and Central Europeans, the large, I'll put it politically, I'll put it gently, the large Central and West European states, which have traditionally dominated the politics of the EU, yes, and which have in fact in past centuries had alliances with antecedent states of the Russian Federation. They will be concerned because they still entertain the fantasy of being world powers. And how can you be a global power if you don't have a global power as an interlocutor? I think this is part of the only part, but part of the psychological set, also behind their extension of ties with China and their resentment of the United States, since the United States was built by people who left Central and Eastern Europe because they were poor and had nothing to lose, and they made a great success. So it's just I'm also partly completing what I understand to be your thinking, and you can correct me if I get anything wrong. But I just wanted to clarify that I was not, I put the question in this way in order to elicit the response that I did. And of course, it's all going to be path dependent. We don't know how it's going to play out in 5 or 15 or 25 years. And I just want to thank you very much for your reply, because as you know, in the mainstream media, even in North America, this idea has barely been mentioned. And of course, there would be circles in the United States that would prefer to maintain a central Russian power for various reasons. So again, I'll just stop there. My comments, my reply is just an indication of,
Thank you, Dr.
of how interesting I found all of the discussion, and also the other speaker. And I will now let Marios call on other people. And I thank you again for your replies.
Thank you, Robert. That was very interesting, and thank you for this great input being put forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you very much for just being here. Ambassador Gela, thank you very much. I know that you have a tight schedule as well. I know that Mark also had a tight schedule. There will not be any further time for these questions. This is the policies that we're trying to get with the webinars, that we are trying to get 1 or 2 questions after that, assuming that time is there for us. We have gone already more than 20 minutes extra to what we aim to have. But before we close, I will give the floor if Ambassador Gela, you would like to say something before we close this webinar. No? Okay, but thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I would like to thank my dear friend Mark, who I knew that he had an appointment, he had to go on a specific time frame, and he remained as much as possible. But thank you very much to all of you for coming in. Please let me notify you that we're now going into yet volume 2 webinar, which is going to take place next Wednesday at the very same time. Please follow our social media on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and on LinkedIn. And please register for the next webinars to come. There will be much more coming. There will be people from around the world with international discussions and international topics, not only political, but there will be also business, there will be geographical, there will be environmental, cyber, and goes on and on and on. Next week, we travel to East Asia to discover what is taking place over there. With that being said, on behalf of Strategy International, the whole team, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you.